As Israel Defense Forces continue their operations in Gaza, there's attempts to broker a ceasefire and to broker the hostage release for that matter. And these these efforts are intensifying right now. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced that the IDF is going to remain in the recently seized Syrian buffer zone to alleviate the threat of security concerns there. And so in all reality, negotiations appear to be showing some signs of progress. Hamas is signaling, at least, its willingness toward a potential agreement. So what does all this mean for Israel? What does it mean for the Middle East? We got a lot of questions, and joining me now to discuss this is Dr. A.J. Nolte. He's the director of the Institute for Israel Studies at Regent University. Dr. Nolte, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, Jody, it's great to be here, and glad to be back with you discussing these important issues.
Yeah, we were on yesterday, and I apologize. We had to end our discussion quickly because I had a member of Congress who was calling in with an update on a classified briefing that he was a part of yesterday regarding the drone situation. So you and our conversation was cut short. So let's continue that discussion. Negotiations for a ceasefire and hostage release, they've been described by some as cautiously optimistic. Okay, so let's start on that premise. What are the primary obstacles to reaching an agreement quickly? Are you likewise optimistic? Where does this stand as it appears right now?
I would say the primary obstacles to reaching an agreement that we've seen since the beginning of the war are two things. One, for Israel, the destruction of the military and political capabilities of Hamas in Gaza was a necessary war aim. And so Israel has these two war aims. One is to recover the hostages. The other is to destroy Hamas's capability to ever do October 7th again, which for Israel means destroying their capacity to be the political and military authorities in Gaza, see them removed, and essentially put some sort of military and governing capacity in Gaza that is not likely to conduct terrorism against Israel in the long run. I think that's the goal, right? So here's the problem with that. And this has always been the challenge that the Israelis have faced since the beginning. For Hamas, those hostages were a trump card that they could use to preserve their own survival, and that they were hoping to use to preserve their ability to continue to govern and be the primary military force in Gaza. And so they put Israel in a position where it has constantly having to choose between getting the hostages back and achieving its war aim of preventing future hostage taking and future terrorism, right? So this is a very, very difficult situation. Add this to the fact that in Jewish thought and Jewish law, the redemption of Jewish hostages that are being held, particularly in horrible captivity by anti-Semites, is a primary moral objective. It's very important in Jewish law and Jewish thought. And so this is a particularly acute challenge and difficulty for Israel. And it was a difficulty that was created by Yahya Sinwar because he got out of prison during a deal to release an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, who had been held captive. He was one of the prisoners that was released in that hostage deal. So he knows what he's doing. He set this up as sort of as a deliberate trap for Israel. And it's been challenging. The reason why people are optimistic now, frankly, is that circumstances have changed on the ground. Hamas has lost most of its outside backing. The so-called ring of fire that Israel or that Iran had created around Israel is gone. And I think one of the death blows was that Hezbollah, which had on October 8th started attacking Israel as part of the ceasefire. And people have often wondered, why would Netanyahu agree to a ceasefire in its conflict in the conflict in Lebanon? Well, part of that ceasefire is Hezbollah essentially is out of the war with Hamas. They have decoupled. They've said we are no longer going to fight until until there's a ceasefire in Gaza. We're done. And so Hamas's allies are crumbling around them. Sinwar, of course, is dead. And so I think the leadership in Hamas at this point is trying to get whatever deal they can. And then, of course, you also have the rhetoric of President Trump, which I do think is a significant factor here. Because President Trump understands in the Middle East, you have to project strength. And his comment, unspecified hell will be paid if these hostages are not freed by the time that I'm inaugurated. I think Hamas is hearing that and is realizing that this is the guy who killed Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, at the end of his term last time. And so this is not a guy who makes idle threats like that. So I think all of these factors have put Hamas in a position where they want to try to get some sort of deal, the best deal that they can.
Yeah, that's you wrap that together powerfully. And this has been an amazing tightrope that Israel has walked, trying to save the hostages while at the same time destroying their enemy. And now it is interesting to me, and what you just brought up with Trump, that's really a good point, because I'm kind of curious what role American diplomacy is playing right now to secure a deal. It seems as though the Biden and Trump teams are at least reportedly collaborating right now. And so what role is America having, apart from perhaps Trump and his comments that you just referenced, in diplomatic attempts?
Let me add one other factor in terms of complicating factor for Israel, and that is there's a particularly complicating factor for Netanyahu himself. Because on the one hand, there's been immense pressure from hostage families to get a hostage deal, and many of them are saying, we want a hostage deal at all costs. And those are some of the most prominent voices. And I think that's a perfectly understandable position for them to take it to their family members, and we can all sympathize with that on a gut level. On the other hand, Netanyahu sees Iran as the proximate threat, and he wants to deal with that threat. And I think he wants to have his legacy be having dealt with that. And then on the third hand, there are members of his coalition that don't want to see any kind of deal because they're primarily concerned with Hamas and crushing the situation in Gaza. So it's a very complicated calculus for Netanyahu as well. And because of the bizarre political situation in Israel, bizarre from an American perspective, of course, the Israelis would think it's normal, but it's a very complicated internal balancing dynamic that he's got, and that complicates things. Now, on the U.S. side, I think you're right that both Trump and Biden have the same goal. And their goal is Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel wants to get the hostages back. But I think this is an area where we see a fundamentally different understanding of the Middle East between the Trump and the Biden teams. The Biden team sees the best way to get to a deal is by Israel not rocking the boat and sort of not escalating. And their thought is, any escalation by Israel could lead to a situation where more hostages die. And indeed, to be fair to that perspective, there's some evidence that there have been some hostages that may have been killed in the past because the IDF was getting close to them. Okay, so that's not a totally unreasonable position, but it is a position that complicates things for the Israelis. Trump, I think, is more of a belief that at all costs project strength, and that you project strength, you stand behind your allies, and he is going to much more want to put pressure on Hamas by saying, look, if you don't do this, there are going to be severe consequences. And we could think in particular of the way Trump, told that story in the debate about making a very personal threat to the leader of the Taliban forces in Afghanistan about consequences that were going to happen to that man, with pictures attached, if any U.S. service members were killed. And so it's a very different approach. It's a very different tone. And I think that Netanyahu will probably find it easier to work with the Trump administration because I think he shares more of that strength-focused idea about how to project power effectively in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think you're very correct in that assessment. So what about Turkey? I mean, we have Turkey's military interventions in northern Syria, mounting tensions with the Kurdish forces. How is all this reality going to influence the broader dynamic surrounding the entire Middle East?
I think that's really good and a very good question, and it brings into focus another pivot point, which is related to this whole thing, which is Syria. Why is Syria a pivot point? Because the simplest way of describing what just happened in Syria is Iran lost, Turkey won, and Syria and Israel is somewhere between a win and a draw. So Iran lost, Assad was Iran's proxy. Russia also lost. They were both very much proxies of Syria. Iran, because Syria was the pipeline to support Hezbollah, which is their queen on the chessboard. If you look at the Middle East as a chessboard, Hezbollah for Iran was the queen because it's a Shia power that allows them to attack Israel. Syria was a vector that they used to both protect the queen and also get supplies to them. Russia had warm water ports in Syria. That looks like it's gone. Turkey has now won. The proxy groups that are often either al-Qaeda linked explicitly or descended from al-Qaeda / some other Muslim Brotherhood forces in Turkey or in Syria, those were heavily backed by the Turks. And so Turkey now looks like it's the primary actor. And so as we turn the focus to Israel for a second, certainly Iran is a dangerous, immediate threat. Turkey is not as immediate of a threat. They're not going to take as immediate direct action against Israel, nor do I think that their government that they're backing in Syria is going to take immediate actions to sort of, for example, purge minorities, which I know a lot of people have been concerned about. But Turkey is dangerous in the long run because they have a long-term regional strategy. And Erdogan has been very clear that he sees himself as bringing back the dominance of the region that Turkey had during the Ottoman Empire. And if you look more deeply into some of the propaganda that's going on in Turkey, which is a side interest of mine and research that I've done in the past, what you'll actually find is that Erdogan's narrative is that the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was a tragedy. And one of the primary actors that he blames as responsible for this is Zionism. And the Zionists he sees as having undermined the Ottoman Empire and led to the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. And so he wants to sort of restore that Ottoman sphere. So long term, Turkey is quite dangerous because they will have, as a Sunni power, legitimacy with many actors in the Middle East that Iran simply couldn't have. And so I do think this is a short term, potentially a win for Israel, but also the instability makes them nervous. They kind of knew how to deal with Assad. The Assad regime was horrific, don't get me wrong. But the Israelis, for their own personal security, they knew how to deal with them. They're a little uncertain. And Turkey has not always been a positive actor for Israel. So I think there's a lot of concerns that this raises in the long term. Although it's always good to see a genocidal dictator overthrown, I think the Israelis are looking at it with a little bit of wariness. And that has prompted some of the actions they've taken recently.
Yeah, no doubt. And questionably, I get it, but Turkey being an ally, a NATO ally, I mean, that kind of complicates things as well. But we don't know that Iran played a significant role in the attacks. And we also know that the Biden administration released some $6 billion or whatever to the Iranians. So is this yet another failure of leadership, in your opinion, or is this from the Biden administration, or is this a slap in the face to Israel?
I think that there's probably no area of Middle East policy where I'm going to be more critical of Joe Biden personally and of his administration than Iran policy. And I think I've said this to Tony in the past or on some other media hits. You can go back to right after 9/11. There's an article from the New Republic in October of 2001 called Rhetorical Question, which of course is about Biden, it's just a great title. But in that, he muses about the possibility of giving millions of dollars to Iran after 9/11 because they're a Sunni or they're a Shia country and Al-Qaeda's Sunni, and of course they never worked together. We know now that's false, that Iran did cooperate with al-Qaeda strategically when they thought it was in their benefit, even though they were fighting in other areas. So he's just not been good on Iran for a long time. The Biden administration was very bad on Iran in a number of different ways. In some ways, following after the Obama legacy on Iran, which was terrible, and in some ways even intensifying it. Contrast that with the Trump administration, which was very strong, and it looks like they're going to be strong again. A little inside baseball for your listeners, and this is a smart audience that'll appreciate this. So if you look at the Trump transition, one of the guys who was a point person for foreign policy is a man named Brian Hook. And Brian Hook, from what I'm given to understand, was a key actor in a lot of the first term anti-Iran sanctions policies and the maximum pressure campaign. And so, that was a signal. And a lot of the appointments that Trump has made since then, has announced since then, have been a signal that, he's going to go back to that maximum pressure campaign with Iran. And that's a good thing.
It is a good thing. Wow. Dr. A.J. Nolte, Director of the Institute for Israel Studies at Regent University, always fascinating discussion. whenever you're on Washington Watch with us. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
Your graciousness to come back on the program last night after we had to be today after we had to be cut short yesterday. I appreciate it so much. God bless you. Merry
Absolutely.
Christmas
Thank
to
you. Merry Christmas.